Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining in again for our weekly webinar series. This one is called Executing in Uncertain Times, and it's part of our now weekly series on looking at doing business in the age of coronavirus. This webinar is presented by Smith Business Insight and by Queen's Executive Education. My name is Meredith Dalt, and I'm a business journalist at Smith School of Business, which is at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Before I introduce today's speaker, I want to remind you, as I always do, that this discussion will be recorded and you will be receiving a recording in your inbox soon, like probably within a couple of days, maybe even sooner. So you'll be able to review the whole presentation again, look at the slides, the whole thing. So stay tuned for that. If you want to ask a question of our speaker, and I hope that you will see the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use that button for chatting, for sending questions over to Kathryn, and I'll get those to her. So do ask questions, because that makes for a much richer discussion. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Kathryn Brohman. Dr. Brohman is an associate professor and distinguished faculty fellow of management information systems at Smith School of Business. She has co-authored several books on how great strategy is worthless if you can't execute it. Her most recent book, Shift: A New Mindset for Sustainable Execution, presents results from her work with over 750 organizations and tackles the classic tension between short-term and long-term goals. Kathryn has pioneered programs in strategy execution and digital transformation across MBA and executive programs at Smith School of Business. Kathryn, thank you very much for joining us today. I'm going to turn myself off and let you take it from here. I'll be back in 45 minutes or so.
Great. Okay, well, thank you, Meredith, and welcome everyone. I thought I'd start by just talking about the motivation for this webinar a few weeks back, and it really started when the signal started to emerge that the COVID-19 restrictions would begin to loosen. And for many organizations, I've worked with quite a few the last 6 weeks or so, there was a sense of hope that things were going to return to some state of normalcy. But admittedly, a lot of uncertainty about what comes next. And so we thought it's important to start a conversation with regard to, specifically with regard to execution. And as mentioned in my intro by Meredith, this is one of my areas of expertise here at Queen's. And I started in this area about 10 years ago. And the reason I did was I was intrigued with this question, which is, why do organizations that create impressive strategies fail in their attempts to get results? And there's some really interesting research in this space, a lot of it driven by PwC, but it's around the idea of, organizations, 90% of organizations 30 years ago were really good at getting that green line in this diagram around execution to meet their strategic goals. And that's down to about 40% now. And so it's really challenging in today's day and age. And a lot of it has to do just with the amount of expectation on industries, the disruption that organizations are going through. And so that's really my area of study here. And I want to talk a little bit more about that before we get into the COVID-19 reality. So this is a framework, and I will spend some time on this quite a bit, but it is related to my new book that came out in November of last year. And this I call a new mindset for execution. And really it comes down to a story about how in my own career, so I managed big enterprise resource planning systems prior to becoming an academic. And there's this really interesting notion about what I call A to B, which is, if you run a project or an initiative, we kind of run towards that, finish line. And oftentimes we exhaust resources and energy as we're chasing that down. And inherent in that are some things that we do that we can resolve. So for example, like if you push people really hard at the end, you can give them maybe a week off or that kind of thing. And then there's other things the organization does that become more systemic and cause bigger problems later. And that's this red line in this diagram. And you'll hear me call it two things. One is the drag factor, which is you think about, I use the analogy of energy, an energy system for execution in this book. And so drag is really a source of friction. It's that those things that hold us back from getting things done. And some great examples of that I'll talk about throughout this presentation. But on average, organizations have about 4 of 12 barriers active at any given time that hold execution back. And that's where I get that 0.32 number. So if you think about the 32 number as sort of a factor that we pay, or it costs us in terms of time and money every time we execute something. So for a week, you would say 0.32 or 32% of that week would be caught up in this drag, or for every dollar, we're paying 32 cents in drag. And so let's pause here for a minute and get you to think about a project or an initiative. And it can be one you are extremely proud of, or it can be one that maybe you struggled with. But I'll use this diagram as a way to define what those lines mean and why they're important. And so the first question I have for you is, did you meet your target? And so that's the blue line. And so did you pay for additional resources? Did you ask people to go above and beyond? And maybe even you had to cut some corners, as we all do as project managers, especially near the end. For example, maybe you went forward with something without getting formal approval. But the blue line really suggests that you can recover from those things. So, yeah, like I said, people were tired, but you can give them a bit of a break. Or maybe you have to take a bit of heat from your boss, but they understand why you did what you did around having to save time or drive something to the finish line. The red line really gets into how you achieved it. And so throughout your project, you might have found these things that frustrate you, and many people see them as burdens. So I use the example a lot of just creating reports or analyses that people ask you to do, but then like oversight committees don't use them. Or the amount of time we spend in getting buy-in and getting people politically aligned to a project. And so I do a lot of work in healthcare, and I can be months inside a project within the healthcare industry just to get people, all the stakeholders aligned and less resistant to that change. Another one that unfortunately I see a lot of is the idea of stress and burnout. And this is just the idea that we, exhaust our team to that from A to B, but then we keep pushing and we never really give them time to recover. And so this is one, unfortunately, I see a lot. And all those things are these drag factors. And so you can actually calculate the amount of drag inside your organization using the online tool that supplements my book as a way to identify how much energy is being wasted through those drag factors. So you might be surprised to learn that I've actually come across companies, Meredith mentioned got over 1,000 now that have done this assessment. And I've seen this red line factor, cost of execution, I call it, up in some organizations around 70%. And so what happens with that is that when it's that high and it sustains that long, unfortunately, we start to see long-term effects on our customers, and that's the green line. So this is, if we let those barriers to execution manifest themselves inside an organization, eventually our customers will become less satisfied, employees will become less healthy. We see it sort of creating this resistance to change. And so this is the green line performance, which is when those execution barriers have been allowed to hang around too long. And using these indicators, we can assess whether or not we're ready as an organization to, keep our foot on the gas with the change initiative, which would suggest that, our cost of execution isn't too bad, or it really tells us that maybe we need to put on the brakes and adjust some things inside the organization before moving on to the next phase. And so this is a summary of what I talk about in this book. And what I wanted to do was to highlight one of the findings of my research, which really inspired this work I've started around COVID-19 and what I call the post-pandemic drift. So one of those things I found was when faced with adversity, 78% of large incumbent organizations tended to play things safe when it came to driving change. And this was a really interesting insight because it, some people like to refer to it as kind of fear or, but this idea that people knew that they, needed to change, but then when faced with adversity or faced with risk, they tended to what some people say is play not to win, which is, or playing things safe. And so when COVID-19 happened, I started to see things that were contradicting that. So we see a very highly adverse situation, and some organizations really surprised me in terms of the companies that I was working with, and even the ones I read about in the media that were just having these sort of massive lifts through COVID-19. And so that's what I want to talk about. And it really does come down to, like, this slide really does come down to resilience. Like I thought that a lot of companies lacked resilience. And, you know, through COVID-19, I think we've been maybe surprised that organizations are a bit more resilient than maybe I thought they were. And so the one example I want to use here is a great Canadian example with Sobeys, and they're not alone in terms of who's enabled these massive shifts. But if you've been to any grocery store, you see these plexiglass shields that are put up, and Sobeys actually did this in 14 days. And so 18 hours a day, they called in extra resources and they worked really, really hard. And chances are, I mean, I don't know the details of this story because I wasn't directly involved in it, but they, you know, chances are they accelerated things like budget approval and stores paved their way. But I also think that there were probably some execution barriers that might have disappeared. Maybe, again, maybe they surprised themselves in how they actually achieved that. And so if we think about that from a, for people that are a bit more visual or they prefer illustrations, I can explain this in a different way. And so the blue line is really maybe what we would have expected Sobeys could have thought they could install these plexiglass shields. So again, this isn't real case information, I'm just using it as an example. But you know, you think maybe it would take them 6 months. And so what we see is this massive infusion of added resources and paving the way. And certainly, I mean, that's not sustainable long term. What we've seen with these massive lifts is really a result of just, you know, people being less busy with other elements of their job. And so we can load up the resources, and people were very willing to, especially stores, to go above and beyond. But I do think that there were some of those barriers that disappeared. And so, and I have found evidence of this in the companies that I'm doing some specific work for. And so what were those? And these aren't specific to Sobeys, but I'll give you a few examples. So one of them is, you know, perfection was put on hold. So people just became extremely fine with good enough. And I think about that a lot around the idea of a minimum viable product, which is a great technique that we see coming out of the agile space. But, you know, there are some barriers that exist around perfection, you know, or people or even departments not wanting to let something go until it's absolutely perfect. And through COVID, I mean, we were fine with just sort of good enough, which I think is an interesting evidence of some barriers that are disappearing or disappeared through this. The other thing I've seen is related to that. People explain they were faster to agree on what work, as opposed to people, you know, having to be right or better. And so again, another great, you know, common barrier I see is just infighting between organizations about we should do it this way or we should do it that way. And that disappeared. You know, people were just willing to agree on things and find that common place of consensus to move forward. A lot of companies I'm seeing now, and I'll talk about this in a little bit as well, but embracing digital. So this whole idea of technology and any kind of resistance, I mean, those were barriers before. People just didn't want to work from home. People didn't want to teach online. And now we've been forced to do that. And people, I think, are recognizing the potential there. And so technology is one of those barriers, or at least the resistance to technology. And finally, stress and anxiety inherent in the organizations. This was an interesting barrier to see go away. And I think it really is coming from people feel that that the leadership is really truly caring about them, like very in touch with how they're doing in their health. And this is actually increasing levels of engagement. And so I will talk about these more formally, but I think it was important just to anecdotally give you some ideas of, you know, what's inside that red line. And really, I spent a lot of time today in that webinar talking about that. And so what does that mean through all of this? And it basically means that, you know, in the Sobeys situation, they could deliver something in 2 weeks. And what's the opportunity moving forward really isn't the green line. I think all of us would agree we don't, when we come out of this, when these restrictions start to lift, we don't want to be in the same situation we've been in the last 6 weeks. But I guess my biggest message to organizations is maybe, you know, to set a goal for yourself to not come out the same. so we go through all this challenge, it would be nice to come out a little bit better. And I think the opportunity there is in that red line, right? What barriers did we see disappear that we can maybe prevent from coming back? So this slide is a formal definition of some of the barriers that I'm starting to see in my research, and I'm starting to understand that COVID had a difference. And so probably the most common one I'm seeing is that, organizations just have more clarity about what goals are most important. And there's nothing like a great, a crisis to put us back to, focusing on what's most important. And so, organizations are moving forward saying, we just had too many goals coming into COVID-19. And so we're just going to really focus on what's wildly important to us in our business. The second one I'm seeing a lot is people are recognizing the need for reserves. And so if you're an organization who had invested in any kind of lean methodologies, so maybe some people around Six Sigma, but I think there was a lot of reserves were taken out of the organizations. And I think companies are really recognizing that we need some. So we don't want to be too lean. And so recognizing the need to put some of those reserves back. The third one is really around decision authority. And so a lot of recognition around what can happen when you truly empower the people in the middle and maybe even lower ranks of the organization with more decision rights. And this one is getting a lot of attention from senior leadership, just how much they hold on to decision rights, and when they can relieve those or release those and distribute them, really starting to see some of those barriers disappear. And then finally, I've talked about this one on the last slide, but people are really feeling their extra effort is valued. I think one company was talking to me about, like, is this what employee engagement feels like, right? Where you truly care about people and their health and how they're navigating stress. And so it really has become much more genuine in the workplace. And so at this point, I'd like to shift a little to explain, why all of this is so important now. So, why this webinar now, what inspired us to do this today. And so it does come back into some research that's not mine, but this is people that have studied prior crises. And on the left axis here, you see sort of this idea of emotional highs and lows. And so that's what the red line is identifying, is if you go back to December of 2019, our emotional, sort of that moderate emotional state, we get the warnings and the threat and the impact where we see an emotional drop. And then we go through these heroic efforts, or what I explained earlier, around those massive lifts that we've seen. And so what's interesting about this is just right now we're fairly confident. So some of you might have heard Dane Jensen's webinar a few weeks back, but Dane and I are working together from a sort of an execution and a resilience perspective to really understand where organizations are. And our indicators right now are pointing towards that honeymoon phase. And so what that says is that we're likely going to head into some very challenging times. And what's inside that is uncertainty, for sure, about where we're headed, and tribulation, just, about fear and, just being uncomfortable with that state. And so asking people to do what we've asked them to do the last 6 weeks, like work overtime and, 18-hour days, I think is a dangerous territory. And so what we want to do is we want to figure out maybe how to get rid of some of those execution barriers, because we're not going to have the same accelerators that we've seen in the last 6 weeks or so. So a couple things here. One is that when executing in uncertain times, existence of drag may actually be the tipping point. So when we're highly uncertain, there's a lot of emotional lows, and you see that coming down specifically in this phase of disillusionment. And so anything red, like any barriers or any kind of, sometimes I like to refer to them as nonsense, will have greater implications on the long-term sustainability, or what we see as the impact of our customers and our employees. And so, there will be a very negative effect. And that's what I'm trying to understand now through my research is what is that effect? Like, will these barriers be even more impactful as we're executing through times of real uncertainty? And the other thing that's adding to this is just, the amount of change we're going to have to go through, and just the uncertainty around that can cause us to go back to old habits. And that's very common from a psychological recovery, is just when things get highly uncertain and a lot of change happens, we tend to nest back into what we know as commonplace and where we're comfortable. And that phenomenon I'm calling behavioral drift. So this is this post-pandemic drift, where we've seen these high peaks of heroic efforts, or seen some productivity, but we're all very aware of what's coming next around, could be around our financial economy, or there's a lot of difficult work that's ahead of us, and difficult, challenging times. And so it's very common for people to drift back into old habits. And so this behavioral drift concept is, maybe you could relate to it as if you've ever tried training or tried losing weight, but we make these great peaks at the beginning, but then eventually we drift back into old habits. And that's really what I want to talk about, trying to avoid. And so if we go back to the Sobeys example and try to put this back into the picture, really what I'm talking about here. So, we know that 2 weeks is not sustainable after the, after this pandemic, or we start to see those restrictions removed. But we don't want to do is, we don't want to go back to business as usual. So we don't want to go back to that 6-month time. And so what we need to do is what I call recalibrate on what's possible. And we're going to do an exercise in a few minutes here that tries to identify some of these barriers that you might see, and really making an investment or making a conscious choice to get rid of them. And if we could recalibrate what's possible based on our insights through COVID so far, the last 6 or 7 weeks, what we might be able to do is bring that 6-month time frame down to about 4.5. I mean, these are just numbers. I'm just saying we should get better coming out of what we've been through as an opportunity to move forward. And so what we want to avoid is this idea of over time drifting back into that those 6-month habits. And the way we're going to do that is to resist these old behaviors. And so to reiterate, some of the things we're going to try and get rid of. So maybe, keeping those number of goals reduced. So not letting other goals creep in and other priorities keep in is a great way to avoid drift. Again, even though financial conditions are likely going to get very challenging, but really trying to keep some reserve in that system to deal with uncertainty, and it may maybe even accelerate work when we have to. Trying not to lose sight of how important this genuine employee engagement is. And so even though we're going to get busy and things are going to get stressful, still keeping to worry about what's going on in people's homes. And so, I have 5 kids, and I mean, there's a lot that goes on in my home front, and that's everybody. And I think we can't lose sight of that. And so really trying to make sure that organizations stay engaged with people and the own stressors and challenges we're all living with. And then finally, truly value people's efforts. So, even if productivity, isn't the easiest to bring back, but really valuing that people are doing their best. And when people do a massive lift or do any kind of, but show them true gratitude towards that. And so if we do that, again, that can help us not only recalibrate around that, but avoid that drift of moving back into old habits. And so what I want to do now is bring us into this idea of 3 steps to avoiding that post-pandemic drift. And so the first one, of course, is returning to the regular business environment. And so this week we've seen a few restrictions removed, and that's going to continue. And for your organization, I think a lot of it is just waiting until you're back into some kind of regular state. And so we get, rid of those long days, you get back to necessary procedures and putting some of those decision rights back in. Some companies that I've worked with, especially ones that are essential, have called it a bit of a Wild West, the last 6 weeks, just kind of running. And so you want to put a bit of that order back into the organization as a first step. This part you can start now. I mean, I think most organizations have seen what COVID has done to them so far. And so recalibrating on what's possible and identifying those unnecessary barriers and causing and getting rid of them this little exercise that we're going to go through gives us an example of that. But I think that's something we can do now. And then finally, I wrap up the presentation with an idea of how to avoid that drift. All right, so we're going to go through a couple of online survey questions in a minute here, but a couple things just before we get started. And I think, so I ask all of you to keep an open mind through this. So the first thing is that, yeah, every company has drag. So, you know, some companies I work with say, we don't have any drag. And I have not found any companies out of the over 1,000, 1,200 that I've worked with that didn't have any drag. So you definitely have drag. And so, like I said, the average is 4 execution barriers in any given organization. So you may have less than that and you may have more, but everybody does. And then please recognize too that what I'm doing here is putting a positive tone on, the opportunities to come out of this better, but none of that is meaning to replace are intended to minimize any of the fear and tribulation and uncertainty that we're going to go through. It's just a matter of balancing those two things out. And then finally, there are four opportunities for recalibration. So at the end of this, there's an opportunity to get a full assessment, like to really understand your organization to a deeper level. But for this webinar, we're just going to focus on one of them, which is synergy. And you'll also notice here that they're all energy forces. And so that's the analogy in my book is just, I've conceptualized execution as a system of energy. And so each of those provide us with different ways to boost our execution system. And like I said, we're going to focus on synergy today. So why synergy? And I think a lot of it's come down to me just, looking at these words and memes around, what COVID's done and the idea that we're all in this together. And so what comes out of that, when you have true synergy in an organization, you get that benefit of 1 + 1 = 3. And so when you have that boost, great things happen with regard to execution. And the one example I wanted to use here was, again, my other area of focus is digital transformation. And, I love this little slide. It's, basically saying who led that transformation. And it was the CEO, the CTO, the Chief Technology Officer, or COVID-19. And again, this is what I'm seeing in that area of work is just major synergy. And that synergy is coming a lot from the relationship between the IT function in the organization and the rest of the business. So synergy is not just, we're all looking out for each other. It can also be sort of the reduction of silo mentality and, company units coming together to create better results. And so that's synergy. And what we're going to do through this one is actually get you to tell me what's happened at your organizations. And so there's 5 options here. And then I'll go through them and you can pick the ones that feel the rest. So maybe you are an organization that experienced those heroic efforts. Maybe you decided you came together on some initiatives, but maybe not heroic, but you definitely saw some synergy improvements. You might have no real change. And then it's important to note here that not all organizations really saw a boost in synergy. Some organizations actually got less synergistic with the idea that we all had to work from home. And then sadly, I have run into a few organizations that have really fell apart through this. And so as we build that, we'll talk a little bit about each of those options. So as we see these results coming in, I mean, there's a really nice indicator around definitely organizations are seeing some of the synergy benefits. So let me go through these one at a time and tell you a little bit about what they might mean to you in your organization as we get some more of these responses in. So the first one, this heroic efforts, usually in my experience, these are organizations that have, maybe in the essential service or kept running. But what's happening here is a lot of these organizations had a lower cost of execution or lower drag factor going in. And so they were able to just kind of create these heroic efforts. But I am seeing even organizations that had a lower cost or higher cost of execution or higher drag were capable of delivering these heroic efforts. I just worry a bit about the aftermath of what they've left behind. And so that's a really interesting group, that first one around heroic efforts, because like I said, if you went in with lower cost of execution, chances are that's what enabled those heroic efforts. But if really those heroic efforts were driven by pressure from the industry, you might actually see some damage coming out of that that will be important to address. The majority of people sit in that B column. So these organizations were oftentimes fast to refocus. And so I'm finding a lot of companies that have like departments that are really busy through COVID and other departments that are on hold, sharing those resources back and forth and really trying to get settled on a 90-day plan to move forward. And so great opportunities inside there with regard to moving on and getting rid of those barriers when we get back to sort of some form of business as usual. A few people who saw no real change, and I think a lot of that's just number of organizations I'm seeing in there just don't have a lot of real pressure. And so I call this the waited out category. This doesn't mean that you can't identify those barriers that might help you after we get through this honeymoon phase, but it's just that you might not have had a whole lot of pressure through the last 6 or 7 weeks. And then we do have about sort of 10% of our people that are in the negative synergy category. And so the first one there, we got less synergy. What I'm finding here is, again, higher drag going into both of these. So oftentimes if we see a synergy reduction, there could have been some execution barriers in there prior to that really made it difficult for any kind of coming together. And so, it's challenging to get synergy considering that, some organizations had put more than 90% of their workers into working from home. And so I think people would have naturally assumed we would have a synergy loss. But these organizations that, were really struggled to find those synergistic opportunities, I'm finding a lot of them had a higher cost of execution going in. And then again, the ones that were completely fell apart, those are real sensitive stories. And so I've only come across 2 in my sort of work so far, and both of them were essential. So they had a lot of real pressure on the organization, but they just couldn't respond fast enough. So again, there's an opportunity to connect with me after this with regard to this research if anybody is very interested in figuring out or pursuing more of a reason why maybe you experienced what you did. I'm happy to have you involved in that. And so we'll just close out of these results and go on to the next slide here, because the next slide, what we can do is really think about, why, or identifying what barriers might have disappeared. And so this was a little harder to answer. And so I will walk through these. And what I want you to do is I want you to check all that apply. So if you experienced a synergy boost, it's probably more appropriate that it's probably more likely that you've identified what barriers might have been removed. But if you didn't and you still want to participate in giving us some ideas, then that's fine too. And so I'll walk through each of these. So resource use was more focused on an important work. And the associated barrier here was really around resources and unproductive uses. So I call this the resource barrier. And so, you might have seen a synergy boost come out of the fact that budget adjustments and these sort of things happened, and money was found for the things that you needed to do. So that's a great barrier to remove, is that resource barrier. The second one, we leverage technology more effectively. The associated barrier here, as I mentioned before, was a real unhealthy tension between maybe the IT organization or your consultants or whoever you're working with and the business. And so I call this the isolation barrier in my work. And certainly we're seeing evidence that barrier is starting to disappear. The third one is departments more inclined to work together. And so the associated barrier here is this idea of it's not my job mentality, which is also part of isolation, but it's a bit different. It's more around your roles and responsibilities. And so people focus so much on it's their job. And so somebody would say, hey, can you help me? And they're like, no, that's not my job. Whereas in COVID, we saw people just really helping each other out. And so we start to see that roles barrier start to disappear. The fourth one is around leadership. So leadership more visible and showed true compassion. And the associated barrier here is lack of engagement. And so again, I think a lot of companies have the opportunity to keep this one disappeared, just because employees know that there is that true compassion in the organization, and preserving that would be great. And then finally, the last one is leaders are just more open to feedback and able to course correct. And this is one in my work I call insularity. And so insularity is an interesting leadership barrier. And it really comes down to leaders maybe not knowing what's going on or not privy to the information that they need. And I think through COVID, we've seen a lot of this type of barrier disappear. Leadership have just been more in touch and engaged with their organizations. And it's been extremely helpful. So as we can share those, what we've got is I've got little areas to fix them. And so we might want to, this is a great result. We've got so many people that are just seeing multiple of these barriers disappear. So what I want to do is I'll start with the two. I think the two at the top are pretty much the most common. And those are both what I call structural barriers. And so what we can do to fix them. So the second one, this is a really neat one. So my recommendation here, so we leverage technology. The way to fix this is to what I call modernize the IT function. Or you can even increase, Deloitte's doing some great work around tech fluency. And so this is a real opportunity to increase the comfort zone, like the comfort level, and get people to truly understand the opportunities that are available by technology throughout the entire organization. And really maybe break down those barriers between technology or technology function in your business. And so great work around just enabling that tech competence, if you will, and those skills. And BrainStation's doing some great work in that space. Deloitte's doing some great work in that space. But I think it's just getting that digital training or that technology training and comfort zone increased. The next one, so the resource barrier, my recommendation here, so that's the first one there, resource use was more focused. And my recommendation here is just to introduce either, stronger portfolio management capabilities or reevaluate your budget process. And so I'm working a lot with CFOs in this space just to make their budget processes a bit more flexible as a way to fix that one. And then if we go down to the, let's go down to the fourth one here. So leadership were more visible and showed true compassion. So what I would recommend here is some rework around employee incentives and performance management systems. And so again, my go-to for that barrier when I see it is the HR organization, and really trying to understand how they're using incentives and performance management systems. And then finally, the one above it, departments are more inclined to work together. So a few neat things. I do call this ventilating silos. It's kind of a neat way to think about filtering and going across those silos within an organization without getting rid of them. And so moving people around, job rotations is a great ventilation tactic, but even just getting people to communicate more. But I think it's this idea of opening up communication across the silos in any way that you can will get at that barrier there around departments. And then finally, the leadership one. So this is, if you remember, the insularity barrier, and really fixing this one is the most difficult. So for those of you who, the 38% that saw this disappear, I mean, I think it's amazing that you saw this disappear, because this is a real leadership adjustment. And so it usually requires that leaders kind of do a deep dive and find out what's really going on, and so show true caring about your organization. So if you did see that, then that is a really, really interesting and highly recommended one to embrace as a real benefit coming out of COVID-19. And so we'll just stop sharing those, and then I just have a few more slides here around wrapping up, and then it's probably a good time too to think about questions that you might have, because Meredith's going to jump back on here after my wrap up and get to questions. All right, so these closing comments are really, I start by just reminding us why this is so important. And so revisiting this slide, just to reiterate the two things that are going to happen. And so the one thing after the honeymoon phase, the two things that are pretty much commonly known from past research are uncertainty, so navigating in very uncertain times. And so, you know, the idea that we're not going back to normal. And so what comes next is really uncertain. And a lot of people talking about what is that new normal and what are we going to look like. And the second thing is real deep-rooted change. And so it's going to be imperative for recovery that organizations do some really hard work. So anything we can do to reduce drag during this times, like reduce that red line factor and you know, decrease our cost of execution, is going to be extremely helpful. And so what's my best advice on that is just first to follow through on the assessment. So, you know, if you hopefully you took some notes, or you can ask me some questions about those specific barriers. But if you did see them disappear, maybe find out how they disappeared and then really encourage your organization to identify them and get rid of them. And then my last recommendation here is really the way to avoid drift. And so I call it adopt a Monday morning routine. And maybe it's just pen to paper. How you do this is less important than how often you do it. So putting it into a weekly routine is really drives the idea that when you're navigating through uncertain times, really all we can bite off and chew is a week. And so every morning you get up and it's you sitting and reflecting or you sitting with your management team, but evaluate if your management approach is driving the right behaviors. So take a look around the organization to see whether or not those behaviors that you're seeing creep back into the organizations are the ones that you admire and are trying to drive. The second thing is to define what work can accelerate and what can push back. So this is kind of your weekly plan. So come up with a weekly plan, take a look around and say, this work, we could probably accelerate this work this week or for the next couple weeks. And then this work needs what I call time to heal. And so, you know, balancing that out in the organization is really important because there's only so much that your organization is going to be able to take coming down that phase of disillusionment. And then finally, I say reflect on last week. And this is a real, again, if any of you were on Julian's webinars prior, I mean, really comes down to self-awareness. Like take a look at your own behavior. Were you visible enough? Were you accessible enough? Are you aware what's really going on? And are you taking appropriate action as a leader? And so I call that the Monday morning routine. It takes about 15 minutes, you know, just to kind of reset for the week and make sure that you do the same thing week after week. The biggest thing about uncertainty, managing through uncertainty or executing through uncertainty, is cadence, right? Just staying true to that to avoid that drift. And again, going back to the weight loss or training, it's the same sort of thing, you know. Rhythm and cadence is more important than actually what you're doing. It's just keeping that week by week routine in place. And so last two comments from me, and then we'll open it up to questions. So final thoughts: without a doubt, what lies ahead will go beyond the challenges we've already experienced. And so things will definitely get better, get more difficult, and before they get better. And so if you set a goal for yourself, really, that you want to come out of this better than you went into it, that is a real nice way to think about, you know, facing all of this challenge as we're actually going to get better when we come out. And the other thing I will say is that true leaders will emerge out of this, and they will be the ones that can figure out how to execute in these uncertain times. And so out of this webinar, I just, you know, maybe it's a great question to ask is, will you be one of them? And so last couple words for me, and then we'll bring Meredith back in. So there's an exec ed email here. I do a lot of work with our exec ed organization. And so a couple of things, if you're interested in participating. So I am doing a research study around post-pandemic drift. And so if that's something you'd like to be interested in, you can email them. And then again, if you liked those little questions and want to do a fuller assessment around capacity and focus beyond synergy, you can email that address as well, and we'll get you one of the customized assessments. So that's it for me. I think we'll bring back Meredith, and I'm happy to
Hi.
answer questions.
That
Hi.
was fantastic. Thank you so much, Kathryn. Lots of questions coming in. Definitely, I think this has been useful for a lot of people. I'm going to just go through some of them as they've come in. At one point, when you were showing us that red line chart, and you talked about a year period, a typical 1 year period,
Yep.
to go through that process. Someone is asking, is 1 year typical for all industries, or is it specific to some? And is it possible to go from honeymoon to reconstruction directly?
So great question. And unfortunately, this isn't not my research. So I'm just new to researching crisis, but I've, read that literature well enough that I think I can comment a bit, but I would, recommend that citation will bring you to more concrete answers perhaps, but I can say, so the 1 year, in their research really depended on whether or not we're going to see a resurgence or a second wave. So it was more dependent on the crisis itself. So if we see a second wave come in, it would suggest that disillusionment phase will extend itself. And this research would say there would be no jumping between honeymoon and reconstruction. And I think it would be they talk about some industries being shorter in their disillusionment phase, but a lot of the disillusionment comes from environmental factors. So like what the government's going to do, a lot of the stress that we've put on our government systems, that really every industry should see some kind of disillusionment phase.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
But now, what if you talked about barriers? What if those barriers are what prevents major errors, possibly fatal errors?
Mm-hmm.
So this person says, I come from an engineering background, and there are tasks within a project that get pushed through, and they seem to work, but then ultimately they fail the whole project. An example would be a simple machine. Each component in that machine works, but as a whole machine, it doesn't work.
Yeah. Great question. And I think for me, I come from a software development background, and it's the same sort of thing. We think we can cut these corners, but then later we see either a cost of quality or some kind of impact. The red line indicators really are those things that we should be getting rid of. So I think about it from a project perspective, and around the difference between what's called a mandatory and a preferred dependency. And so in any kind of project, you have these mandatory dependencies, and that's what we don't want to break. So if you're doing an engineering project and you have an absolute safety would be top mandatory for me. And even in healthcare, those are not drag. Drag are the preferred dependencies that we put in place just because we like it that way. So I always use long reports or reporting on metrics. These are in the drag factors. But the interesting thing about this question is that if your organization perceives those mandatory things as drag, the organization's not doing a good enough job articulating to the people why those controls are in place. And so cost of execution is a perceptual measure. And so oftentimes when I see a company that has a high cost of execution and they're a highly technical company, it's not that those barriers shouldn't be there. It's that people are seeing them as barriers as opposed to enablers. And so sometimes you need to put more language around those barriers and do a better job of explaining to people why they're important. A lot of work in this space around quality control. So I work with a lot of quality organizations, and I mean, they're always being blamed as drag creators. And it's not that their procedures need to change. They just need to do a better job at explaining why their checks and controls are important to the outcome.
Thank you. There are so many good questions here. I hope I can get to all of them. This person writes, very timely presentation of material. Part of the challenge of avoiding behavioral drift among a large employee base is their desire to return to normal. Any suggestions on driving the broader base toward better behaviors and habits?
Yeah, I think I would love to answer this question in 2 or 3 months from now when I see the return to normal happen. But what I would say is I'm seeing the same anticipation that people kind of want to go back. And I think having someone in the organization that has very clear communication that there is no going back is absolutely crucial. And so actually Dane and I are starting a blog in probably about a week and a half on this exact topic, Dane Jensen and I, because I think that there's a real messaging that needs to happen inside the organization around the fact that, we all have to go through this, and there's no, COVID-19 is not going to just go away and then it's just back to what we are. We are in a different place. And so what I would recommend there is just very clear and very transparent and honest. Like I use the word candor in my book a lot, because I think candor is exactly what leadership needs to be. We need to be very honest about the fact that there is no going back. And so that's all about, to me, it's all about, internal communication and positioning that message.
How do we get to read that blog once you've got it posted?
Oh, good question. So it flips back onto Insight. Smith Insight is going to publish our first piece. And so we're just waiting on that to hit maybe this week or next. And then within that Smith Insight piece, Dane and I will continue that in this blog. And what's neat about this collaboration between Dane and I is, Dane's a real resilience, people management person, and I'm more of an organizational design and project management person. So we're looking to start the conversation, and it's primarily to the point I made earlier that I just don't have the answers, because this is all new to me too, right? So I can tell you what previous research tells me, or I can tell you what I knew about execution before, but both Dane and I are totally intrigued with this phase of disillusionment and trying to actually not even just use our own expertise, but get people in that conversation, because it's going to be a tough time to navigate for sure.
Right. Well, so people keep, maybe stay tuned for that. And actually, there are just so many good questions here. I'm hoping maybe you guys can address some of these things in your blog if we can't get to them all today. Yeah. Where are we? Can you share any observations on execution barriers that are more strongly associated with a company struggling over the last few months?
Yeah, I would have to ask for more clarity on that in terms of struggling over the last two. So struggling really tends to indicate that those execution barriers have been around for a long time. And the execution barriers that seem to manifest themselves deepest inside the organization, unfortunately, are cultural. So the barriers around like employee engagement, what I call isolation, which is this silo mentality and almost toxic behavior between departments. The other one that is unfortunately true in, organizations that are in a state like that are really leadership barriers. Like, people don't trust the leadership, or they don't know how they're making decisions. And so unfortunately at that state, that would be my answer, would be probably you're caught up more in those cultural barriers than you would be around, like, I can make a tweak in budget, or I can streamline this process. Like, you're probably beyond that when now we're into more of those cultural barriers to execution.
Okay. What's your view on the value of building trust towards employees and among team members when everyone is working remotely?
Yeah. So, I mean, Jana's webinar that she did a few weeks back would have nailed that. And I think my recommendation would be there to watch that video. So, because I think a lot of it is this concept around virtual work and really putting in the right procedures and giving people the right training really on how to do this. Like I often joke about, or laugh about, when courses started to go online, and it would just be like, just go online, and people would think, well, you learn in a completely different way. And I think we collaborate in a very different way. But I have also seen some evidence of synergy coming out of virtual work, just because you're click a button away as opposed to having to be physically there. And so I think there's a lot that's going to happen in that space. Because the other thing I worry a lot about is just the fact that we can't disconnect work from home. And I think that leads into those emotional lows. And so, I think in terms of what I would recommend, I would recommend somebody in the organization take it upon themselves to recognize this virtual work environment is not just working from home. We need very different procedures and even different incentives. And I would also echo that, just because I've done quite a bit of work in the space around like these companies that are using those performance monitors to calculate productivity. Like, there's a
Yeah.
lot, we've never been in a situation like this. So I feel like those need to be massively rethought. Because the productivity numbers that are coming back to some organizations, I know aren't true. I know that people are working harder at home than maybe the way that those indicators say it. So I think there's a lot of richness here and a lot of work to do. So I would say make somebody in charge of it.
Right. Someone has asked you to clarify a little bit about navigating 1 week at a time. So you mentioned that you can only navigate 1 week at a time during the crisis, but what about the question of long-term planning? Although she follows it up with, did I misunderstand the comment about navigating only 1 week at a time?
Yeah. So
clarify that.
I think that the point I'm trying to make there is that your cadence should be 1 week at a time. And so the cadence of what am I going to do this week, right? What's coming next week? And what did I do last week? It's kind of a 2-week window as to when you're leading through uncertain times. It's sort of the check-in point. But I also would say that doesn't suggest that we can't think about long-term planning. And so I didn't have a lot of time in this presentation, but it's an excellent question because, the companies I'm working with, we sort of separate the people that are looking long-term from those that are looking short, and we make them get along. Right? Because, the CFO is a great person who's projecting and trying to push forward and really understand what the business is going to look like, but they can't disconnect. Like otherwise we get into this, again, bad tension between short and long term. So leadership, I think every leader can do a very personal check-in about their own drift, like what's happening in their own organization to make sure that drift doesn't come back. But getting out of this absolutely requires this effective management of short and long-term tension, which is exactly sort of the idea of getting rid of those barriers and keeping them away.
Well, so along those lines, somebody writes, we've been closed since March 15th. How do you create synergy when we reopen, having been closed for so long?
Mm-hmm. And I think that is another great question. And of course, something that I don't have a lot of insight on yet, because a lot of these companies that have been closed, I won't really get to work with them until they get back. And so I think, the only thing I could go on would really be, try to understand, even now, reach out to your people as we start to see these indicators of these restrictions starting to lift. And pulling people back together. So I might recommend more of like a team building way of getting that synergy back, like getting everybody back on the same page, having some great communication about what comes next. But I would pull from more the team building environment of just, getting people to honestly talk about how they're feeling and what their anxieties are. So it might be like a 2 or, maybe a 4-day, half-day session that you can start getting people back into the groove of talking business, especially if you've been closed that long. Because I always say, compare it to a holiday. Right? If you ever went on a 6 or 7 week holiday, it'd take a long time to get back into the groove of things. And so I think these specific companies, synergy wouldn't be what I would measure. Right? I would probably measure more around capacity and trying to get some kind of work tension back into your system that's healthy to get people back thinking about work.
Fair, thanks.
Yeah.
There are so many other good questions here, and audience, I really wish we had time to get to all of them. We will pass these questions on to Kathryn, and Kathryn, perhaps they will be able to inform some of the writing you do in the future, because these are obviously things that are on people's minds. Mm-hmm. In the short term, I need to remind our audience that you, in fact, will be involved in doing some Queen's Executive Education training in the near future. So every week I remind people that we do all these online programs. You can visit smithqueens.com/execed to learn about different kinds of opportunities for remote learning through live interactive streaming. So Kathryn, you're going to be teaching as part of a 4-day execution program, which is running from June 8th to 11th, which I realize with horror is actually very soon. That's next month. So do you want to give a little plug for what you're going to be doing?
Sure. Yeah. So this is a program. It's been about 4 years or maybe a bit longer, but we've revamped this program in a couple of ways. One, it will be completely virtual. And the second one is we've embedded some of this execution through COVID concepts. So my research will be focused, highlighted in there. A few of the other faculty are doing some similar work. So we're trying to embed that into exactly to the question that one audience member had around, okay, I've been closed for 7 weeks. What do I do now? And so we thought it was extremely timely to do it in June. And so we've cut it up so that the virtual delivery model is a bit not so heavy days. So we've got it down to about, sort of 4 to 6 hours a day. That's cut up in a way that will help everybody navigate through that timing. But we've done a lot of heavy lifting around, what that program is and embedding real valuable insights to bring us through this, at least start us through this phase of disillusionment.
Okay, that's wonderful. So again, audience, visit smithqueens.com/execed. You can find out more information about that program. As I do every week, I will promote next week's free webinar, which will also be next Thursday at 1 o'clock. Join me for Decision Making for Managers, and this will be with Professor Salman Mufti. This session will address the issue of making smart decisions when uncertainty is all around you. We will be learning about a decision-making framework that is effective in both strategic and crisis situations. So as always, sign-up details will be posted on the Smith Business Insight website, and you will also get an email inviting you to attend, and I do hope that you will. Kathryn, thank you so much for being such a wonderful presenter. I know that this has been hugely useful for our audience, as I can tell from the questions. We're just always so grateful that people are willing to give their time to the Smith community and to our friends and listeners and audience. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
And for our audience, thanks so much for participating. We love having you join us. So on behalf of the Smith School of Business, thank you very much for tuning in and enjoy the rest of your day.